The economic opportunity for new mines in Northern Ontario is clear. Global demand for minerals has been soaring, and there's a tremendous opportunity to create new jobs. In Canada, Ontario has been a leader in mining for almost a century, responsible for 1/3 of Canada's total mined metal production. Significant mineral finds, such as the Ring of Fire, and recent court cases supporting Aboriginal and treaty rights with respect to mining activity, make it a critical time for a greater understanding of the environmental and social impacts of mining in Ontario. For many communities, mining holds attractive potential for economic benefits. However, it is also important to understand what mining means in the long term for northern ecosystems and community health and prosperity. While the life of a mine can last a few years, the footprint it leaves on the land can be permanent. In Ontario, the mining industry is currently booming due to high commodity prices. Mineral resources are non-renewable and represent a resource owned by the people of Ontario. This presentation provides an overview of the mining process and related environmental and social impacts to support dialogue on land use decisions in Northern Ontario. It also summarizes resources available to help communities engage in the planning processes associated with mineral exploration and mine development. In 2011, there were 33 operating mines in Ontario. Approximately 2/3 of these were gold and base metal mines, with a palladium and a diamond mine also in operation. The rest of Ontario's mines are mainly located in the southern part of the province and produce minerals such as silica, gypsum, talc, and salt. The Ring of Fire is a recent mineral find consisting of one of the world's largest chromite discoveries. It is located about 500 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. The deposit has attracted international attention from the mining industry and is estimated to be worth about $30 billion. International mining companies have staked over 9,000 claims, covering 480,000 hectares. The Ring of Fire also includes significant nickel and copper deposits. Demand for chromite is high worldwide, particularly in countries like China, which is the largest global consumer of ferrochrome, an alloy made from chromite used to produce stainless steel. The consequences of the scale of industrial development proposed in the Ring of Fire are massive. Over the next 10 years, the infrastructure needed to develop the mineral resources in the Ring of Fire could open up a vast area of Northern Ontario through air, rail, and road links to future mineral and other kinds of resource development. Due to the location of the find, remote First Nation communities will experience most of the social and environmental impacts of this project. Raising awareness of the implications of large-scale development is important. Once development is approved in the Ring of Fire, change will come fast to Ontario's northern remote communities. The demand and prices for metals goes through periods of growth and periods of decline. When mineral prices go up, mines are quickly built, benefiting the communities around the mine with jobs, development, and money. The increase in mineral value makes the cost-benefit of extraction great enough to spur mining development. This is the boom. Eventually, a point is reached where the mineral at the mine location is depleted or the mineral market is saturated and prices begin to decline. The results are layoffs, downsizing, and eventually mine closures. This bust can happen gradually or it can happen over the course of a few years, leaving many host communities with social, economic, and environmental challenges, including high unemployment, youth and labor pool outmigration, and environmental damage left behind by many mines. The average operating lifespan of a mine in Canada is relatively short, generally lasting between 15 and 20 years. However, the entire process of opening and closing a mine requires activities that might continue over hundreds of years. This includes the upfront work to find and develop suitable mineral deposits, and the long-term monitoring and remediation that are often needed to avoid environmental contamination once a mine site has closed. The set of activities that describe the different stages of mining is called the mining sequence. It is helpful to understand the mining sequence as each part of the sequence comes with different demands on communities and the environment. Prospecting is the process by which minerals and metals are discovered. It often involves searching rock formations on the ground and/or geological data for clues about possible mineral deposits. If prospectors believe that an area is worth further geological investigation, they will stake a claim that gives them exclusive rights to do more work on the property in the hopes of finding mineral deposits that are valuable enough to develop a mine. In Ontario, claims are usually staked on the ground using claim posts and by blazing lines on trees and on the ground. Ontario now has map staking in some parts of the province as an intermediary step to online staking. Some provinces use online map staking, which allows those who have prospecting licenses to claim exclusive mineral rights directly from their computers without ever setting foot on the property. Ontario is moving towards an online staking system over the next few years. In Ontario, the ownership of surface rights and mining rights are different from one piece of land to the next. Prospecting and staking are based on the free entry system. Free entry means that almost any area of open Crown land can be staked, including land traditionally used by Aboriginal people and communities. Private property is also open to staking if the owner of the surface rights does not also hold the mineral rights on the property. However, the new Mining Act gives property owners in the near north the opportunity to request that their properties be off limits to staking. The province can refuse the request if it is deemed there is significant mineral potential. In southern Ontario, all private properties that didn't have claims were closed when the new Mining Act was passed. As claims over private property in southern Ontario lapse, the property will be closed to future staking. Once a claim has been staked, exploration begins. Exploration determines whether there is enough ore of good quality to make it worth developing a mine. Historically, the government recommended, but did not require, that companies initiate contact when undertaking preliminary exploration activities near Aboriginal communities. However, under Ontario's new Mining Act, this will be a requirement. There are two levels of exploration: preliminary and advanced. Preliminary exploration can involve the following activities: ground surveys, airborne surveys, limited stripping and trenching, limited bulk sampling, various forms of drilling to remove rock samples from deep in the rock, and trail, road, and water crossing construction. In advanced exploration, activities such as more extensive trenching, stripping, bulk sampling, and the construction of underground access tunnels may occur. Dewatering of underground tunnels may be necessary, which involves the removal or draining of ground or surface water from a mine site by pumping or evaporation. The construction of more permanent access routes may be required, and the construction of more substantial buildings and camps usually happens at this stage. During advanced exploration, an area may be permanently altered because of the leveling of the site, removal of vegetation and soil, and drainage associated with construction. The Mining Act is limited in its regulation of some of these potentially damaging activities. For instance, surface stripping that displaces less than 10,000 cubic meters or extraction of less than 1,000 tons of material from the ground is not considered advanced exploration under the Act. The environmental effects of exploration can include the loss of options to protect culturally or environmentally important lands from development, trail and road and trenching erosion, which can lead to water and soil quality issues, disruption of wildlife habitat, as well as harvesting and fishing activities, contamination from fuel, hydraulic fluids, garbage and sewage, noise pollution, and acid mine drainage, where exposure of certain minerals in rocks creates acidic runoff from a mine site. Exploration activities are often done by smaller, junior companies that raise money from investors that bet on a company finding a potentially valuable deposit. These companies are not very stable and may only last a few years before they go bankrupt, reform themselves, or are bought by another company. Projects are also often bought and sold between companies. Most junior companies do not have ambitions to open a mine, hoping instead to sell up their claims and potential project to a buyer that can take it to another level. This is a challenging reality for communities that are trying to engage with the industry, as efforts put into building positive relationships can be lost when a project is sold. If feasibility studies show that mineral extraction is possible and economically worthwhile, then a mine may be built. This is the mining and milling phase, during which operations consist of the following activities: mine construction, new roads and power corridors, stripping and storing of soil and vegetation, ore extraction, crushing or grinding of ore, mine and surface water treatment, and storage of waste rock and tailings. The environmental effects of the mining and milling stage can include contamination of surface water and groundwater, increased erosion and sedimentation of lakes and streams, wildlife and fisheries habitat loss, heavy metal leaching from acid mine drainage, changes in local water balance, potential acid generation from waste rock and pit walls, noise and windborne dust, and lands and forests covered by waste rock piles and tailings disposal areas. The concentrated ore that has been separated from the tailings is usually transported off-site for further concentration or smelting. The milling process that is used to extract valuable minerals from the ore can require the use of large amounts of poisonous substances, such as sodium cyanide and sulfuric acid. Cyanide is commonly used to separate gold from the host rock. The problem with the use of these chemicals is that they can be acutely toxic to humans and wildlife. Fish and aquatic invertebrates are particularly sensitive to cyanide exposure if it gets into streams or lakes. Cyanide is toxic to many living organisms at very low concentrations. Freshwater fish are one of the most cyanide-sensitive groups of aquatic organisms. Hazards to fish, wildlife, and livestock are well documented. Massive kills of freshwater fish by accidental discharges of cyanide wastes are not uncommon. In one case, cyanide-containing mine effluents from a Canadian tailings pond released into a nearby creek killed more than 20,000 steelhead. In the 1990s, there was a spill from one of the Hemlo mines that impacted the drinking water source for the Pic River First Nation. The crushed rock, water, and chemicals that are left over from milling creates sludge called tailings. Tailings include the materials that remain after the valuable portion is separated from the uneconomic portion of an ore. Profitable concentrations of minerals range from 5% for base minerals to 0.0005% for precious metals such as gold. This means that, generally speaking, a minimum of 90% of the processed ore becomes tailings waste. Tailings represent the most significant long-term environmental liability created by mining projects. Because of the extreme hazard they present to human health and the environment, tailings need to be contained and are usually kept on site as tailings ponds. Tailings ponds often require clearing more land to hold mine waste than the rest of the mine combined. The failure of containing structures that hold this waste can result in a massive release of toxic tailings materials. Dam failures do not occur often in Canada. The potential for environmental damage is significant when they do. A tailings dam failure near Matachewan in 1990, for example, released over 195,000 cubic meters of tailings and washed out 1.5 kilometers of highway. A large portion of tailings were released into a nearby creek leading to the Montreal River. Other examples in Canada are a failure of the tailings dam near Chapet, Quebec, release of mercury tailings into Pinche Lake in British Columbia, and a tailings spill at Ekati Diamond Mine in the Northwest Territories. One example of a large tailings disposal facility is the Kidd Creek metallurgy site owned by Falconbridge near Timmins, Ontario. The site processes copper and zinc ore. The Kidd Creek mine includes a disposal site that stores more than 100 million tons of base metal sulfide tailings. The tailings pile is 1.2 kilometers wide and 25 meters high. The site is surrounded on 3 sides by Porcupine River tributaries, increasing the potential for significant contamination of fish-bearing waters if the containment structure fails. Improperly maintained tailings ponds can also result in a slow, ongoing release of pollutants into the environment that may go undetected if tailings ponds are not monitored regularly. As such, they are of great environmental concern. For example, more than 80 years of silver mining around Cobalt, Ontario, has led to widespread contamination of water with arsenic. Metal leaching from mine waste in the area has led to the contamination of parts of the watershed, with dissolved arsenic concentrations much higher than what is allowed by law in drinking water. A 2005 report by the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario noted that about half the closed mine sites that require regular follow-up inspection had not been inspected in over 5 years. All mines have one thing in common. No matter how long they last, production will end at some point. In the past, many mines were abandoned without proper reclamation. Today, the government requires companies to prepare mine closure plans. The goal of a mine closure plan is, as much as possible, to return a mine to a safe, environmentally sound, and productive site by removing structures, grading roads, and covering the mine site with vegetation. Each closure plan will be different, depending on the nature of the mine and the level of site remediation required. The closure must follow a plan filed with the government and must be backed by financial assurances for rehabilitation, mitigation, and monitoring costs. Under Part 7 of the Mining Act, a mining company must provide financial assurance to the Ministry to cover the closure costs identified in the site's closure plan. Financial assurances are supposed to ensure that there are sufficient funds available for the proper closure of a mine in the event that a mining company cannot or will not meet its closure plan obligations, for example, as a result of bankruptcy. Having enough financial assurance is supposed to protect taxpayers from paying for mine closure costs that can run from several million to several $100 million per mine. There are several issues with assurances. Is the amount sufficient? Are the assurances transparent? And should a company be allowed to self-assure? Essentially, should we assume that large companies are unlikely to fail? And has there been an independent review of the closure costs? As with operating mines, one of the biggest challenges in mine closure is to protect the water around the mine site. While rehabilitating, the surface of an old mine may be reshaped, buildings removed, topsoil added, and grass planted. But the key concerns are what is going on underneath the surface and the long-term integrity of tailings impoundments. Forecasting mine site reclamation costs is an inexact science, and costs associated with long-term maintenance, like the costs required for water management, can be substantial. Problems arise when the mining company is no longer operating or goes bankrupt. If the financial assurance is not enough to cover the cost of mine closure and reclamation, the government is forced to pay the difference. Since 2002, Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments have spent close to $1 billion to manage the 10,000 plus abandoned sites across Canada and prevent new ones. In Ontario, the government spent $88 million between 1999 and 2008 to rehabilitate the highest priority abandoned mine sites at the taxpayer's expense. Almost all mines will require ongoing monitoring, maintenance, and/or water treatment. Some will require monitoring for generations beyond the actual closing of the mine. A monitoring program, usually developed by the company and approved by government, is used to assess how well reclamation measures are working after a site is shut down, and also to identify corrective actions where needed. The length of the monitoring phase is reviewed when the mine closes and depends on the potential impacts and risks to the environment. If the site needs long-term care and maintenance, the mining company remains responsible for the site, including remediation of any additional environmental issues arising after closure. Problems arise when a closed mine site remains so hazardous that it requires monitoring essentially forever. As with any industry, mining companies come and go, which raises the question of who will be responsible once the mining company is gone. A 1996 panel report by the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency on how to manage uranium mine tailings near Elliott Lake, Ontario, illustrates the potential lasting nature of a mine's legacy long after it has stopped production. The panel stated, given the permanent nature of the hazards presented by the tailings, the panel recommends that an adequate containment system must be supported in perpetuity by effective care and maintenance programs. Experiences in Ontario with the failure of tailings containment structures and the inherent difficulty of predicting long-term environmental impacts means that no mine can simply be walked away from. Just like mine development, mine closure also has impacts on a community. This includes the loss of jobs and income used to support the growth of a community while the mine was operating. It also has a direct and indirect impact on local employment, businesses, and the sales of goods and services. Communities need to consider how mine closure will affect the local environment and the social structure of the community after the mining operation has ended. A single mine is the center of a web of development that includes the construction of roads, power generating facilities and transmission lines, impoundment areas, and dams. The energy used by the mining industry represents 7% of Ontario's industrial electrical power use. Cliff's proposed ferrochrome production plant, required for their proposed Ring of Fire development, would be the single largest user of electricity in the province, equivalent to a city of 350,000 people. Mining can permanently change the character of a landscape in a number of ways, from stripping and flooding productive lands to limiting opportunities to pursue other land activities. Some of the worst environmental offenders from the mining industry in Canada have left water bodies so polluted that they are unfit for human use and cannot sustain healthy ecosystems. In British Columbia, the Mount Washington mine near Comox produced copper for only 3 years, but since then, toxic copper leachate has been contaminating the headwaters of the Holsum River for decades and ruined a multi-million-dollar salmon fishery. As a result of local citizens' efforts, restoration activities, although very costly, have been able to bring back some of the salmon. Acid mine drainage has been identified as the biggest environmental liability facing the Canadian mining industry, and it is estimated at $2 to $5 billion. The possibility, severity, and timing of acid mine drainage can be very hard to predict, which makes it difficult to plan for mitigation of impacts. Acid mine drainage occurs when waste rock or tailings that contain sulfides are exposed to oxygen and water to generate sulfuric acid. The chemical reactions dissolve heavy metals from the rock and combines with the acids, which produces a toxic mixture. Acid mine drainage occurs when waste rock or tailings that contain sulfides are exposed to oxygen and water to generate sulfuric acid. The chemical reactions dissolve heavy metals from the rock and combines with the acids. Acidic runoff from these rocks into local streams and lakes can have devastating impacts on aquatic life. As water acidity increases, the number and abundance of fish, macroinvertebrates, and aquatic insects decreases. The metals may have acute or chronic toxic effects on aquatic organisms, many of which are more sensitive to metals than humans. Although there are a number of ways to reduce the development of acid mine drainage and treating mine effluents, there are no technologies that allow a company to close a mine and walk away from it. In most cases, any mine that exposes metal sulfide-bearing rocks will need to be monitored and potentially treated for hundreds of generations after the last miner has worked there. It could take hundreds to thousands of years for some sites to become acid neutral and stop leaching into the environment. Acid mine runoff isn't the only means by which toxins from mines can enter water sources. Processing ore requires the use of chemical agents mixed with water that contain such toxins and environmental contaminants as cyanide, hydrochloric acid, and chlorine. These chemicals are often discharged either intentionally or accidentally into local water supplies. Many acid rock discharges also contain elevated levels of toxic metals like nickel and copper, with lower levels of a range of other compounds like arsenic, manganese, lead, and aluminum. Toxic mine drainage with elevated metals can occur without acid mine drainage. It is a problematic assumption that if there isn't acid mine drainage, or the acid mine drainage risk is low, the risk of water problems is also low. Neutral mine drainage can still have concentrations of zinc, selenium, and arsenic. The mix of chemicals in mine effluents may have synergistic effects. Downstream monitoring required by regulations shows that mines, even those that are meeting regulations, are still having impacts on aquatic ecosystems. Determining which chemicals in the mine effluent are the cause of the problems can be very challenging. Ontario has established water quality standards enforced through the Ontario Water Resources Act, which are supposed to protect water resources from pollution levels above established thresholds. Unfortunately, the province has allowed the mining industry to continue its long-standing practice of dealing with waste by releasing effluent into otherwise healthy water bodies and relying on rivers and streams to dilute pollution levels. These areas where pollution levels are allowed to exceed provincial water quality objectives are called mixing zones. Where mixing zones have not been approved or discharge levels have been exceeded, charges can be laid, but this generally does not happen. For example, there were 50 breaches of established water pollution thresholds by the mineral sector in Northern Ontario in 2005, but no convictions. An examination of the provincial database of environmental exceedances is telling. In 2010, one Ontario mine exceeded the acute lethality test on trout 12 times. Some of the processes for dewatering mines, like those used in the De Beers Victor Diamond Mine, flood areas that naturally contain mercury and convert it to a highly toxic form called methylmercury. Methylmercury affects the central nervous system and, in severe cases, irreversibly damages areas of the brain. The Mushkegowuk Environmental Research Centre has been sampling fish in the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers and finding higher than normal levels of methylmercury. As a result, Ontario's Ministry of the Environment changed its fish consumption advisory for a stretch of the river near the mine, an important First Nations fishery, to 4 meals a month from the previous 8. This is just one example of how mining can have far-reaching effects beyond the actual boundaries of a mine site. Road building or extraction and others can lead to the release of soil and sediment into nearby streams and lakes. Water quality and aquatic habitats can also be affected by increased amounts of sediment in the water column and settling on stream beds. When it is suspended in the water column, sediment can cause tissue rot and even directly kill fish. When sediment settles, it can smother fish eggs and aquatic plants that can decrease both reproductive and survival rates for affected species. Increased turbidity, where light that is unable to penetrate the water due to suspended particles, can decrease water temperatures and make it hard for fish to locate food. Water is essential to many phases of the mining sequence. The mineral sector is the 4th largest industrial water user in Canada, using about 1.7 billion cubic meters of fresh water per year. Of these 1.7 billion cubic meters, 78% is discharged directly into lakes and rivers without being treated. High-pressure water is used to strip soil and vegetation, to keep dust down during construction, to separate ore during milling, and to flood tailings and waste rock areas. However, the activity that places the largest demand on freshwater supplies is the dewatering of mine pits and shafts. Dewatering is required to keep the mine dry and reach the ore. This water comes from surface and groundwater sources. The process of dewatering can sometimes result in large-scale landscape slumps or depressions. One of the requirements of the metal mining effluent regulations is to conduct acute lethality testing on rainbow trout and an aquatic bug called the water flea, or Daphnia. The effluent passes this test if more than 1/2 of the test animals survive in the effluent for 96 hours. While most mines in Ontario pass this relatively crude test most of the time, there are important exceptions. In 2010, the McWaters mine, southeast of Timmins, failed 12 of their 23 rainbow trout tests. Of course, impacts on aquatic ecosystems occur at much lower concentrations of toxics than those that cause acute lethality. The actual footprint of many mine sites will continue to endure even after reclamation efforts have been undertaken. An open-pit mine site may be as large as 5,000 hectares. However, the actual footprint of a mine, including areas impacted by exploration and dewatering, can be as much as 300,000 hectares or 600,000 soccer fields. Mining is one of the least efficient extractive industries in Canada. Of all of the material removed from the ground by a typical Canadian mine, 42% is immediately rejected as waste rock. Of the remaining half, nearly all of it, 96%, is turned into slag and toxic tailings. Only 2% of what is removed from the ground can be converted into value. All told, over the course of a given mine's life, it may produce hundreds of millions of tons of waste, much of which will remain hazardous in perpetuity due to the risk of acid mine drainage and heavy metal pollution. The process of producing metals from its ore is called smelting. Smelting represents another layer of potential environmental impacts associated with mine production. Emissions from smokestacks have improved greatly since the days when Sudbury, one of Canada's foremost ore processing locations, was also considered one of the most polluted cities in North America. That being said, smelters and blast furnaces continue to release airborne pollutants from smokestacks. Mercury, lead, benzenes, arsenic, chromium, lead, manganese, dioxins, furans, and a number of other highly toxic compounds are released and end up settling in predictable plumes downwind of the release points. Once in the soil, some of these toxins are taken up by vegetation and can then move through the food chain, becoming more concentrated through the process of bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation is the increasing concentration of toxic substances as they move up the food chain. As the highest on the food chain, humans eating contaminated wildlife or plants will have the highest concentrations of toxins in their body tissues. Another concern is the impact of fuel spills at exploration sites. It is unclear how often fuel spills at exploration sites go unreported, as these usually occur in remote areas that have little or no regulatory oversight. Although companies are required to document and clean up fuel spills, anecdotal accounts of fuel drums lost in bogs at an exploration site near McFalds Lake indicated that large spills may not always be properly reported and cleaned up. In Ontario's Boreal region, access roads and transmission lines that serve remote mines cut through the forest and interrupt the landscape. Biologists call this landscape fragmentation because it divides the continuous forest landscape into smaller pieces. Fragmentation reduces the quality of forest habitat for wildlife and provides travel corridors for predators like wolves. This interferes with normal predator-prey relationships and increases the chances that wolves will catch prey species like deer, moose, and caribou. Fragmentation also increases access for human predators, which can lead to increases in hunting and fishing pressure. Landscape fragmentation is one of the reasons for the loss of Ontario's woodland caribou populations. There are also clear relationships between building accessible roads in the boreal forest and the decline of other species like lake trout. As far back as 1991, a Ministry of Natural Resources report made the link between the decline in the lake trout population from overfishing in Ontario, among other factors. The level of fishing in a particular lake is directly linked to how accessible it is by road. Often the larger scale impacts from mining occur indirectly, from activities such as road building and infrastructure development. Experience in Ontario suggests that building roads into the forest tends to have a multiplier effect. One road creates many new access points, which in turn attracts more use and further fragments an area. Once a road is built, it is very difficult to get public support to close the road once the original use is finished. A mine may be in production for only 15 years, but the irreversible and long-term impacts of fragmenting land for mining are rarely considered. The most intrusive aspect of mining on the land base may be the huge area of land that is reserved for mining but never actually developed. Currently, over 5.4 million hectares of Ontario's lands are under active mining claims, representing an area larger than Prince Edward Island. If minerals of economic value are found on any of these lands, they could be developed into mines, whether the land is privately owned, subject to First Nation or Métis land claims, or already used for other purposes that are incompatible with mining. The reason that so much of Ontario is already reserved for mining is that obtaining a claim under the free entry system is extremely easy. Individuals who pay $25 to obtain a prospector's license can stake as many claims as they like, as long as they pay a nominal claims registration fee and perform at least $400 annually of assessment work. Compare this to the millions of dollars and the many years spent by communities doing land use planning, public consultations, and review before other land uses, like transportation, forestry, protected areas, or agriculture, are allowed to proceed. Prioritizes mining over other land uses is leading to major conflicts between mining companies and communities. Many have had to issue moratoriums or stage blockades to protest unwanted mining activity on their lands. Mining has social impacts, both positive and negative. Positive social impacts that can result from mining in the short term include creation of jobs and training opportunities and increased infrastructure spending. However, even when mineral development results in economic growth, the benefits are not always shared equitably, and local communities closest to the source of mineral development can suffer the most after a mine closes and stops producing revenue. In the longer term, communities exposed to fast-paced resource development can experience the following negative social impacts: increases in crime and antisocial behavior, changes to community social character and identity, strained relationships and family breakdown from the time spent away, increased costs of living, decreased community cohesion and attachment, and economic downturn following mine closure. Compared with other major mining areas of Canada, Ontario has the lowest return to government for the value of minerals produced from the mining tax, at only 1.5%. Of the limited amounts paid on the value of the mineral production, none of it is targeted to northern communities to support infrastructure development and maintenance or deal with negative social impacts. The readiness of communities for the change in lifestyle that sudden economic development brings is something that should also be considered as part of understanding the impacts of a mining project. Often communities and citizens near mining operations who are concerned about their health and the environment don't know where to go to find reliable information and resources. The following are some examples of tools, resources, and strategies that are used by some communities to protect their lands and waters. Too often, people don't know until after the land base around them has been stripped of vegetation, drilled, and explored, that areas they use regularly have been designated for mining. If you have concerns about an area, contact the claim holder sooner rather than later to improve the chances that sensitive areas or those with important cultural values can be protected. The Ontario government has a catalogue of current mining claims that can be seen online in a database called Claim Maps. The new Mining Act will require companies to file exploration plans and request permits that could increase the transparency and accountability around exploration and requires Aboriginal consultation. The details, however, remain to be determined. If you encounter difficulties with the claims holder or can't get the information you need, ask your member of provincial parliament for help. Call, write, fax, or send an email to your MPP describing the problem. You can also contact your regional mining recorder. The type of environmental assessment required by the provincial or federal government usually depends on the kind of regulatory trigger. In other words, what kind of development activity is being proposed. However, the new Canadian Environmental Assessment Act will not have triggers. Instead, it will have a project list. The environmental assessment process can either be simple or very complicated, depending on the type of project. It can take the form of a simple screening of companies' documents, or it can involve detailed research and extensive hearings. It can be carried out at the provincial level, the federal level, or both. For example, Cliff's proposed chromite mine in the Ring of Fire is in the early stages of an environmental assessment under both the federal and provincial Environmental Assessment Acts. Ontario, however, doesn't automatically require the application of the Environmental Assessment Act to mining projects. Various elements of a mine may be subject to the Act, but a complete evaluation of a mining project is not required because the province maintains that it is a private project and that there are no provincial decisions to allow a mine to go ahead. It assumes a mine will go ahead, providing it meets the technical permit requirements. This is an unusually regressive stance and is unique in Canada. Ideally, every environmental assessment is designed to be a participatory public process where First Nations and stakeholder concerns can influence the outcome. In some cases, groups can apply for government funding to participate in the federal EA process. However, it can be very challenging for individuals, groups, or communities to access the resources or technical expertise needed to successfully represent themselves in a complex EA process. Citizens should not rely on an EA to run its course and deliver the safeguards they seek if they are not actively involved in the process. Concerned individuals can participate by attending open houses and sharing their ideas, submitting comments to the EA agency, participating in public hearings should there be any, and encouraging others to do the same. Communities can also negotiate independent monitoring agreements with mining companies, as well as impact and benefit agreements. Companies are required to post their draft closure plans for public comment. Information based on Part 7 of the Ontario Mining Act and enabling regulations on how to review and comment on a mine closure plan is available at canaryinstitute.ca.